The basic inquiry of an 8-year-old child muted a packed town hall gathering at left Donald Trump, relating a very intimate narrative concerning loss and atonement in religion. What followed brought everyone to tears. The church fellowship hall in Shreveport, Louisiana hummed gently with the sound of chairs being folded rubbing against the floor in polishing and whispered discussions the space normally reserved. For Sunday, potlucks and Bible study had adopted that evening an odd aspect. Donald Trump stood at front of the room, his imposing presence filling the modest hall. His orange-colored complexion, their distinctive hand movements were recognizable to everyone, although tonight he seemed uncharacteristically reserved, maybe recognizing the significance of the incident the audience was at. Mix of families, retirees, and local neighbors curious to hear what he had to say. But among the crowd there was one individual that seemed out of place, not because of her size, but because of her calm intensity. 8-year-old Lily, dressed in her nicest Sunday clothes, hugged an old leather-bound Bible to her chest. It was a treasure passed down from her late grandmother, its pages tattered and its gold letters faded. Her mother sits beside her and whispered before they came, "You can ask him, but only if you're courageous enough and only if you intend it." Lily had nodded, her heart beating in her chest. She had been preparing her inquiry for weeks, jotting it out in her notebook during recess and mumbling it to herself as she lay in bed at night. That wasn't an inquiry formed from childish curiosity, yet one that dragged on her soul as the evening proceeded. Trump spoke about his typical themes, policies, successes, and the future of America. The crowd occasionally clapped or nodded in agreement, yet the enthusiasm was lukewarm compared to his customary rallies. Lily waited here, little hands grasping the margins of her Bible tighter with each passing minute. Finally, the floor opened for questions. A line immediately developed with adults eagerly come up to ask about local issues, national policies, and even a few remarks about his trademark red tie. Lily hesitated, her little form shrinking lower into her seat, but when her mother gave her a slight nudge, she knew it was her moment. Her legs felt unsteady as she stood, her heart beating so loudly she was certain the entire room could hear it. The queue felt endless, but as she inched forward, the room's hubbub began to diminish. Everybody spotted her with the small girl with the large Bible gripped tightly to her chest. Whispers reverberated through the crowd. When her turn came, Trump looked down at her, his expression momentarily softening. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice remarkably gentle. Lily swallowed hard, grasping her Bible so firmly her knuckles turned white. Then, in a voice that trembled but refused to shatter, she asked the question words had been reverberating in her heart for months. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The room collapsed into an immediate and total hush. Eyes darted between the girl and Trump, the weight of her query weighing down on everyone like a tangible force for a man famed for his rapid-fire replies. Trump didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at her, then at the Bible in her hands, and something about his mood shifted. But before he could speak, the air in the room seemed to thicken with expectation, pulling everyone to the edge of their chairs. Trump's quiet was almost deafening for a man who had built his career on swift comebacks and unshakable confidence. This delay felt weird. Harry glanced at Lily for a long moment, his customary bravado replaced by something milder, almost vulnerable. The Bible she held drew his eye again, and his lips parted, but no words came. Lily adjusted slightly, her petite frame appearing even more vulnerable under the room's collective gaze. Her question had not been designed to challenge or provoke. It had been honest, born from a deep wanting to understand something larger than herself, and somehow that earnestness was louder than any political dispute or yelled slogan. The crowd stayed hushed. Even the squeaking of chairs or the muffled cough appeared to evaporate, as though the whole air was holding its breath. Trump eventually raised his hand slightly, as if to stabilize himself, and leaned against the podium. "That's a significant question," he began. His voice is quieter and steadier than usual, "because it's not one I've always had the answer to." The admission stunned many. Trump recognized, for his unwavering confidence was expressing uncertainty in front of a crowd. He looked back at Lily, and his countenance switched again, this time to something almost paternal. "When I was roughly your age," he said, "I had a lot of Questions regarding God. Also, my parents would take me to church every Sunday. Remember sitting in those pews, gaze at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even listening to me. He paused again, this time staring out at the audience, as though measuring their reaction. His hand rested on the edge of the podium, fingers tapping lightly against the wood. My father used to tell me, he went on, that faith is like a ladder. You ascend it one step at a time, and sometimes you're terrified you'll fall, but you keep climbing because there's something up there worth aiming for. At the time, I didn't comprehend what he meant. I thought it was just something he said to keep me silent. A slight giggle resonated through the audience, releasing the strain just slightly. Lily, nevertheless, didn't grin. Her eyes stayed riveted on him, waiting for the real response she had asked for. Trump leaned forward slightly, his tone softening even further. However, when I got older, life brought a lot of challenges my way. Endured losses, failures, and moments where I wasn't sure if I could keep going. In the times, I didn't always feel like God was around me. Sometimes I was upset at him. Other occasions, I feared maybe he'd given up on me completely. The room stayed captivated. It wasn't the typical polished rhetoric or practiced sentences they were used to hearing. This was something raw, something honest. But I'll tell you, this, Trump said, his voice firming up slightly. Even in my lowest moments, when I believed I was alone, I discovered that faith wasn't about always having the solutions. It's about believing that even when you don't see the complete image, there's a purpose, there's something higher at work. He gazed back at Lily, whose grasp on the Bible had weakened slightly. Her big eyes glistened under the bright lights. And God, to me, he said slowly, is that purpose. He's the reminder that even when we fall, even when we fail, we're not done. He's the one who constantly telling us to ascend the ladder, even when it feels like it's going to break. But before the weight of his remarks could fully settle in, Lily's eyes welled up with tears, and the crowd began mumbling gently, sensing that something spectacular was unfolding. Lily's tears came gently at first, a single drop trickling down her face as she grabbed her grandmother's Bible tighter against her chest. But then, as Trump's comments hung in the air, his shoulders began to shake. The crowd saw their whispers increasing louder, yet no one dared disturb the moment. Her mother leaned over, immediately placing a soothing touch on her back. It's okay, sweetheart, she said softly. But Lily shook her head. This wasn't sadness. It was something far deeper. Trump had spoken words she hadn't known she needed to hear, and in doing so, he had touched a part of her young heart she had long guarded. Trump seems to notice her reaction and took a step away from the podium, his face on characteristically subdued. What's your name? He inquired gently. Lily, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. That's a great name, he added with a faint smile. You know, Lily, sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest ones to answer, and sometimes those questions remind us of what actually matters. Lily nodded, her tear-filled eyes never leaving his. My grandma used to say that too, she said quietly. She said, God is always listening, even when you don't hear him. Trump's expression sparked with something unspoken, a blend of adoration and understanding. He took a deep breath, turning his focus back to the crowd. You know, this small kid just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to ask. What does God mean to us? It's not an easy question because it makes us look inward. It makes us face our fears, and our weaknesses. The room was totally still, the weight of his words pushing down on everyone. For a second, it felt as though Lily wasn't just a small kid with a Bible. She was a sign of something far bigger. Her daring had transformed the tone of the entire evening, converting it from a routine town hall into a highly intimate reflection on faith and compassion. Trump continued, his voice steady yet softer than before. We live in a world where we're continuously hunting for solutions outside of ourselves. We imagine power, success, or money will fill the voids. However, they don't. The true answers are the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that make us ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And who am I when no one else is looking? He halted, his gaze returning to Lily. Thank you for reminding me of that, Lily. You're wiser than most grown-ups. I know. The crowd burst into faint applause, yet Lily didn't seem to notice. Her weeping had stopped, replaced by a smile of quiet pride. She wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her garment. She gazed up to her mother. She grinned back at her with sparkling eyes of her own. Yet, as the applause subsided, Trump's tone shifted once more, signaling that this talk was far from done and that the room was about to be pulled. Go deeper into his tale the room got. Silent still, like though the air itself was waiting for Trump's next comments. He shifted slightly at the podium, his eyes searching the throng before falling back on Lily. There was a sadness in his expression, a weight that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than politics or public life. When I was a young man, Trump began, his voice weaker now. There was a moment I thought I had it all figured out. I had ambition, ideas, and the determination to succeed. However, there was one point in my life, only one, that made me realize how little power is actually had. He paused, allowing the words soak in. The crowd leaned closer, there curiosity palpable. Trump rarely gave a peek into his personal life, and now it seemed he was about to. My brother Fred, he proceeded, he was one of the kindest, most real folks I've ever known. He has a brightness about him, a goodness that I couldn't completely fathom at the time. Nevertheless, Fred struggled. He had his demons, and no matter how much my family and I tried to help him, it wasn't enough. Trump's voice faltered for a brief moment as he cleared his throat. When he passed away, I was angry, upset at him, angry at myself, and enraged at God. It couldn't see why someone so good, someone with so much promise, have to leave this planet so soon. Lily's gaze stayed riveted on his, her young face carved with a face far too wise for her age. Around the room, others looked similarly captivated, their expressions a blend of tenderness and interest. For a long time after that, Trump continues, I turned away from God. I wondered if he was real. Why would he let that happen? Why would he take someone like Fred and leave me behind? He inhaled deeply, his hand grabbing the edge of the podium. But suddenly, something changed. I don't know if that was a dream or just a memory, but one night I saw Fred's face in my head. He was smiling, this enormous, silly smile he used to have, and I heard him say, don't be furious. Dawn, you've got job to do. The crowd was silent, the weight of his words weighing on them like a palpable presence. Even the faint sound of automobiles passing outside seems to vanish, leaving only Trump's voice and the collective beating of hearts. I realized then, he said, his voice steadying, that faith isn't about comprehending everything. It's about trusting that there's a purpose even when you can't see it. And maybe, just maybe, Fred's objective was to show me that he turned back to Lily, his expression softening. Thus, when you ask me what God means to me, I'll say this. He's the reason I keep going even when it's hard. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves, and he's the one who gives us hope even at the darkest times. Lily's eyes shimmered again, yet this time her tears didn't fall. Instead, she stood a little taller, grasping her grandmother's Bible with both hands as though it were the most precious object in the world. Yet just as the room appeared to calm into the gravitas of his story, someone in the audience raised their hand, shattering the quiet and dragging everyone's attention in a new way. A man in the rear of the hall stood slowly, his hand still raised. His rough face, laced with years of hard labor, bore a stern expression. He was the kind of person you may pass on the street without a second thought. A mechanic, a father, maybe someone who attended church sporadically when life allowed. His speech, however, pierced through the quiet like a bell. Mr. Trump, he said, his words calm and thoughtful. I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about fury, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder if all of us have been too terrified to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem? The question seemed to catch Trump off guard. Although he didn't hesitate for long, he leaned slightly on the podium, his gaze meeting the man's. He began, I think a lot of us are hesitant to confess we're not as strong as we like people to think we are. Faith isn't easy, it's messy. It's complicated, and sometimes it feels like you're simply shouting into the void. Yet the truth is, that's what makes it so strong. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying even when you don't have all the answers. The man nodded, his expression softening as he sat back down. A murmur of agreement went through the throng, but it was Lily's voice that came through. Next, my grandma used to say faith is like sowing seeds. She said, her words clear and solid. Despite her petite frame, you don't always see them grow straight away, but you have to trust they will. Trump grinned, a genuine, almost sensitive expression That seemed to change his usually guarded manner. Your grandma sounds like a very knowledgeable woman, he said. And she's right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way you expect yet. That doesn't mean it's not there expanding in ways you can't see. The discussion seemed to breathe new vitality into the room. Folks began to nod, share glances, and even whisper discreetly to those seated. Alongside them, what had started as a structured town hall had transformed into something considerably more personal, a joint contemplation on life's challenges, uncertainties, and moments of grace. An older woman, her silver hair tucked back into a tight knot, raised her hand next. I lost my husband last year, she said, her voice trembling. I've been angry with God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith altogether. Do you think it's too late to discover it again? Trump walked closer to the edge of the stage, his voice quiet yet steady. It's never too late. He said, faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you, and sometimes it's at the quietest moments when you least expect it that it comes back to you. The woman nodded, tears shining in her eyes around the room. Others appeared similarly moved, some dabbing at their faces with Kleenex, others merely sitting in thoughtful silence. But as Trump's statements sunk into the hearts of those in the room, it became evident that the evening wasn't simply about questions and replies anymore. It was about connection, and what happened next would only enhance that kinship. The room seemed electrified now, not with noise, but with a palpable warmth of shared vulnerability. Folks who had arrived anticipating a normal political discourse were instead part of something extremely personal. It was as if Lily's simple query had opened a door place no one had dared approach before, and suddenly, no one wanted to turn back. Trump straightened his gaze, sweeping the room. He said, there's something I've learned over the years. Trust doesn't always show up at grand occasions. It's in the small ones, the instances when someone provides a hand, listens when you're hurting, anyone poses a question as daring as Lily's. Beautiful moments remind us of what matters. The audience was hushed, relying on every word. Trump's voice, so often powerful and unyielding, suddenly carried a humility that touched a chord. He gestured at Lily. This tiny kid reminded me tonight that faith isn't only something we talk about. It's something we live, and when we live it, it spreads. At that, Lily smiled softly, here cheeks still pink from earlier. Her mother pulled her close, murmuring something in her ear that made the girl's smile grow just a bit more. Trump's tone grew harder. We're living in a time when it feels like the world is driving us apart. Politics, opinions, disparities, but faith has the potential to bring us together. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing that same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how different our journeys look. A ripple of applause began, slow at beginning but gaining momentum. People stood clapping, not just for Trump, but for the moment itself, for the courage it had took Lily to ask her question, and for the answers it had dragged out of everyone in the room. After the cheers subsided, Trump leaned in one last time. Thus tonight, I'll leave you with this. Ask yourselves what faith means to you, and don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how uncertain it might be. Because faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing. He halted, letting the weight of his words settle before adding, and if you found something tonight that affected you, hold on to it, let it grow, and share it with the ones who need it most. The assembly erupted in applause again, but this time it was accented with hugs, handshakes, and even a few tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with little more than courteous nods now lingered, exchanging laughs and stories. It seemed as if a collective weight had been lifted, replaced by a quiet hope. Lily, currently standing with her mother, witnessed Trump step away from the podium. He stepped over to her, kneeling slightly so they were eye to eye. Thank you, Lily, he remarked, his voice low yet serious. You've got more courage than most folks twice your age. Don't ever lose that. She nodded, her little hand extended to shake his. Thank you, Mr. Trump, she said, her voice steady now for answering. Trump stood, giving her a weak smile before turning around to wave at the fans as he exited. The room stayed alive with chatter then. Folks evidently changed by what had recently unfolded. Lily gazed up at her mother, her voice gentle but determined. Granny would have been proud, wouldn't she? Her mother grinned, tears welling in her eyes. She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed. As the hall progressively emptied, The lingering message was apparent. Perhaps the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected responses, and in those replies, we find the bits of ourselves we didn't know we're missing. If this story touched your heart, take a time to think on your own religion and share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together.